It begins with a single misplaced line on a map that should not exist. I found it tucked between the brittle, yellowing pages of a 1922 topological survey, a document that had been misfiled for nearly a century in the damp basement of a municipal building in Brussels. The line was too straight. It ignored the natural contours of the valley, cutting through the dense forest with a geometric precision that defied the surveying tools of the era. I touched the paper, and it felt cold, as if the ink itself held a chill from another age. They told me it was a clerical error, a smudge, a ghost in the machine of history. But errors do not have symmetry. Errors do not align with the magnetic north of a world that was erased before we were born. Ask yourself why a government would spend 40 years cataloguing every pebble in a province, only to lose the very maps that defined its borders. It was not a mistake, it was a redaction, not a slip of the pen, not a trick of the light, an erasure. The map showed a city where the official record claims there was only swamp. It showed a network of roads where the historians say there were only deer tracks. I stood in that basement, the smell of rot and old glue filling my lungs, and I realized that the history we are taught is merely a narrow corridor built to keep us from looking out the windows. What if the walls of that corridor are thinner than we think? What if the maps were not lost, but hidden? I started to look for the patterns in the silence. I began to track the missing volumes, the empty shelves in the National Archives that all seemed to correspond to the same 3-decade window in the mid-19th century. It is a hollow space in our collective memory, a gap where a global empire once stood, now filled with the white noise of industrial progress. The deeper I went, the more the geography began to shift. The mountains stayed the same, but the scars upon them changed. I saw foundations of star-shaped fortresses built with a load distribution that mocks modern engineering, their stones fused together without mortar, yet the plaques at their gates claim they were built by peasants with wooden shovels. We are told to believe the impossible so that we do not notice the obvious. The map in Brussels was just the first thread. When I pulled it, the entire tapestry began to unravel, revealing a landscape of high-frequency energy harvesters and atmospheric power grids that have been rebranded as mere cathedrals and monuments. They call it the Great Reset of the 1800s. I call it the theft of the world. The ink on the second map was different, a deep, metallic violet that shimmered when held against a candle's flame. I found this one in a private collection in Prague, held by a man who spoke in whispers and kept his shutters closed even at noon. He didn't want money, he wanted a witness. He showed me the Tartarian signature, a script that looks like flowing water but carries the weight of iron. This was not the work of nomadic tribes. This was the cartography of an integrated global society that understood the Earth's magnetic flux better than we understand our own internet. Ask yourself why the name Tartaria appears on every major world map until 1850 and then vanishes as if swallowed by the sea. They say it was just a regional term, a vague label for a vast, empty wilderness. But you do not build thousands of miles of irrigation canals and megalithic stone walls for a wilderness. You do not establish a postal system that spans 2 continents for a void, not a desert, not a wasteland, a civilization. I looked at the Prague map and saw the grid lines. They weren't just for navigation, they were technical schematics. The cities were nodes, the towers were transmitters. The entire world was wired for a frequency we can no longer hear. The institutional gatekeeping began almost immediately after the last of these maps was confiscated. The universities were funded to rewrite the narrative. The museums were built to house the primitive artifacts that would replace the sophisticated technology of the previous era. Every time I found a lead, it led to a locked door or a fire that happened just in time to destroy the evidence. In 1848, the world burned, not in a single war, but in a series of coordinated upheavals that levelled the old structures and cleared the way for the new facade. We are living in the ruins of a masterpiece, told that the rubble is the pinnacle of human achievement. The investigator's burden is to see the ghost in the machine, to recognise that the very stones under our feet were placed there by hands that knew the secrets of the stars. The Prague map showed a mountain range in the Arctic that modern satellites claim is nothing but ice. I asked the collector what happened to the people who lived there. He didn't answer, he just pointed to the violet ink and whispered that the colour wasn't ink at all. It was a residue, a byproduct of a iter, power source that left no smoke, only a stain on the soul of history. What if the mud we see in the old photographs isn't just dirt? What if it is the fallout of a global catastrophe that was weaponized to bury the truth? I began to notice the windows. In every major city, from Moscow to San Francisco, the grandest buildings are half buried. The ground floor windows are submerged in the earth, their sills touching the pavement, their lower halves descending into the dark. We are told this was an architectural style, a raised basement for light and air. But you do not build ornate 10-foot archways only to bury 6 feet of them in the mud. You do not carve intricate limestone friezes to be seen by worms. Not a design choice, not a trend, a burial. I walked the streets of Chicago, looking at the stone foundations of the Great Exhibition. The official story says these massive Romanesque structures were built in months using plaster and wood, only to be burned down or demolished when the fair was over. Ask yourself if that makes sense. Ask yourself why a fledgling nation would expend more resources on a temporary white city than on its own capital. The answer is that they didn't build it. They found it. They unearthed it from the silt of the previous age, gave it a fresh coat of white paint, and claimed it as their own. The erasure trope is most effective when it is hidden in plain sight. They show us the glory of our ancestors to distract us from the fact that those ancestors were not ours. They were the inheritors of a world they did not understand, a world of atmospheric electricity and free energy that had to be suppressed to ensure the dominance of the coal and oil barons. The load distribution in these temporary buildings was designed for permanent, heavy machinery, not for the foot traffic of tourists. I found the engineering logs for the 1893 World's Fair in a dusty annex in Springfield. They were full of contradictions. The math didn't add up. The materials listed were not enough to build a barn, let alone a city of marble. Someone had gone through and scrubbed the references to the old foundations, but they missed a footnote, a single sentence mentioning the pre-existing subterranean conduits that were utilised for the electric lighting. There was no mention of where those conduits came from or who laid them. They were just there, waiting in the dark, a gift from a dead empire that we were told never existed. The silence of the archives is a heavy thing. It is not the absence of sound, but the presence of a secret. I tracked the missing Tartarian maps to a high-security facility in Virginia, a place that doesn't appear on civilian GPS. They call it a records management center, but the perimeter fence is topped with motion sensors, and the guards carry weapons meant for war, not for protecting paper. Why protect a map if it is just a historical curiosity? Why hide a drawing of a country that was supposedly just a nomadic backwater, not a curiosity, not a drawing, a blueprint? I spoke to a former clerk who had worked there in the 70s. He told me about the Level 5 documents, maps that were printed on something that wasn't paper or vellum. He said it felt like cold silk and that it glowed faintly in the dark. These maps didn't just show locations, they showed energy signatures. They showed the ley lines of the earth as if they were glowing veins of gold. He told me that when you looked at them through a certain lens, the cities appeared in 3 dimensions, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic light. This was the cartography of the ether. The Tartarians didn't just inhabit the land, they harmonized with it. Their star forts were not military bastions, they were massive, resonant cavities designed to step down the high voltage electricity of the atmosphere for use in the homes and factories of the people. This is why they had to be erased. You cannot control a population that has access to free, limitless power. You cannot build an empire of debt on a foundation of abundance. The institutional gatekeepers had to turn the star forts into forts and the power plants into cathedrals. They had to convince us that the spires and steeples were for the glory of God, rather than the collection of electrons. Ask yourself why the tops of all these old buildings are covered in intricate copper and gold finials that look exactly like modern antennas. What if they are? What if the cross was originally a technical component, a receiver for the celestial fire? The clerk in Virginia told me he saw a map of the United States from 1750 that showed a sprawling urban complex in the middle of the Nevada desert, a city of glass and light that the history books say was never there. He was fired 2 days later. He told me he still hears the hum of the map in his dreams. The pattern of erasure is global, but the evidence is local. In a small town in Pennsylvania, I found a bridge that was built upside down. The heavy, ornate stonework was on the bottom, submerged in the river mud, while the simple, functional ironwork sat on top. The local historical society said it was a Victorian eccentricity. I saw it as a desperate attempt to use the ruins of a much larger, much older structure to support a crumbling present. This is the staccato rhythm of our history. Build, bury, claim, forget. Build, bury, claim, forget. We are told the pioneers moved west into a virgin land, but the photographs show them standing in front of massive stone buildings that they couldn't possibly have constructed. Not pioneers, not settlers, scavengers. They moved into the husks of a fallen world and renamed the streets after themselves. I spent weeks analysing the load distribution of the old courthouses in the Midwest. These buildings are made of solid granite and marble with walls 6 feet thick. They were built in the 1870s in towns with a population of less than 500 people. Ask yourself who they were building for. Why would a community of farmers need a Roman temple to settle their land disputes? The answer is that the temple was already there. It was part of the old grid, a node in the Tartarian network that had survived the cataclysm. The new government simply moved in, put up a flag, and began the long process of institutional gatekeeping. They created the myths of the founding fathers to obscure the reality of the finding fathers. They turned the technology of the past into the magic of the religion or the mysteries of the occult. I found a diary of a stonemason from 1881 who was hired to renovate a building in St. Louis. He wrote that the stones were already warm to the touch and that when he struck them with his hammer, they rang like a bell. He was told to cover the original carvings with plain brick. He was told to never speak of the copper wires he found embedded in the masonry. He ended his final entry with a question that has haunted me ever since. If we are the ones who are civilized, why are we hiding the work of the savages? The world is a palimpsest, a parchment that has been scraped clean and written over, but the original text still bleeds through the edges. I followed the trail of the missing maps to London, to the heart of the old empire. In the back rooms of the British Museum, there are crates that haven't been opened since the Boer War. They are marked with a seal that belongs to no recognised government. It is a phoenix rising from a bed of flames, but the phoenix is clutching a lightning bolt. I managed to bribe a disgruntled night porter to let me see one of the manifests. It listed atmospheric harvest devices, etheric resonators, and Tartarian scrolls restricted. The gatekeeping is not just about the past, it is about the future. If we knew what they knew, the modern world would collapse in an afternoon. Our entire economic system is predicated on the scarcity of energy. If the air itself is full of power, then the banks are worthless. The wars are pointless. The control is gone. Not this world, not that world, something else. A world where the cities didn't glow with the sickly orange of sodium vapour, but with the cool, clean light of the vacuum. I found a series of photographs from the 1850s taken with an early daguerreotype process. They show the streets of Paris and London completely empty. Not a soul in sight. The buildings are there, magnificent and towering, but the people are gone. They call it a long exposure effect, claiming the people were moving too fast to be captured. But look at the horses. Look at the carts. Even a moving person leaves a ghost, a blur. These streets are sterile. They are vacant. It is as if the population had been harvested, leaving only the stone shells of their existence behind. Ask yourself where the millions of people went. What if the mud flood wasn't just a geological event, but a biological one? What if the maps were locked away because they show where the survivors were taken? I saw a map of London from 1851 that showed an underground railway system that wasn't officially built until 60 years later. The tunnels were already there. They just had to clear out the silt and the bodies. There is a sombre quality to the truth. It doesn't set you free. It makes you a stranger in your own home. I travelled to the ruins of a star fort in the middle of a Dutch forest. From the ground, it looks like nothing more than a series of grassy embankments, but from the air, the geometry is undeniable. It is a fractal. It is a circuit board. The load distribution of the earthworks is designed to focus electromagnetic waves toward a central point where a massive stone tower once stood. I walked to the centre of the fort and felt a vibration in the soles of my boots. It was a low-frequency hum, the dying echo of a world that was switched off. The institutional erasure is so complete that even the people who live next to these sites think they are just old walls. They have been trained to ignore the impossible. I found a technical manual from a defunct German engineering firm dated 1842. It described the process of drawing the fire from the sky using mercury-filled domes and golden needles. It was written in the language of physics, not mysticism. It talked about the dielectric properties of stone and the conductivity of the atmosphere. This is the forbidden knowledge that the archives are designed to protect. The maps I am looking for are not just drawings of land, they are the manuals for the machine. Every star fort, every cathedral, every monument was a part of a global organism that breathed the energy of the cosmos. When the controllers took over, they couldn't figure out how to work the machine, so they broke it. They tore down the towers, removed the mercury, and told us that the domes were for aesthetics. What if the dark ages weren't in the past, but are happening right now? What if we are the ones living in the shadow of a vanished light? I spent the night in the centre of that Dutch fort, and for a moment the hum grew louder. I saw the map in my mind, the lines of violet ink connecting the dots across the globe, a web of power that ignored every border and every king. It was beautiful, and it was terrifying. The skepticism of authority is not a choice. It is a survival mechanism. When you realize that every major historical event of the last 2 centuries has been curated to hide a single truth, you stop listening to the experts. You start looking at the foundations. I went to San Francisco to investigate the ruins of the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition. Like the Chicago Fair, it was a temporary city of incredible grandeur built on land that had supposedly been a swamp just months before. The official narrative says it was all made of staff, a mixture of plaster and hemp fibre. But I found a piece of a fallen column in a scrapyard in Oakland. It wasn't plaster, it was geopolymer stone, a synthetic material that is harder and more durable than natural granite. It was embedded with microcircuitry, thin threads of silver that wound through the stone like spider webs. Not a temporary decoration, not a fairground attraction, a permanent installation. The exposition wasn't a celebration of the future, it was a liquidation sale of the past. They were showing off the technology of the Tartarian era one last time before it was demolished and replaced with the clunky, inefficient machines of the 20th century. Ask yourself why they would destroy something so beautiful. Why blow up the Palace of Fine Arts or the Tower of Jewels? The answer is that you cannot let the slaves see the palace of the kings. You have to convince them that their life of toil and struggle is the only way things have ever been. The maps held in the government archives show the true layout of these cities before the fires and the earthquakes used to reconfigure the urban landscape. I found a map of San Francisco from 1849, before the gold rush. It showed a city with a population of 100,000 people, with paved streets and stone wharves. The official history says it was a tent city of 300 people at that time. The discrepancy is not a mistake, it is a crime. They didn't build the city during the gold rush, they occupied it. The 49ers were not miners, they were looters. The investigative essayist must eventually confront the source of the silence. I managed to track a series of encrypted emails between 2 historians at a major university. They weren't talking about dates or battles, they were talking about the custodians. This is the name given to the institutional gatekeepers who oversee the erasure of Tartaria. They aren't a secret society in the cinematic sense. They are a network of bureaucrats, librarians, and academics who are paid to ensure that certain documents never see the light of day. They are the ones who misfile the maps, who lose the engineering logs, and who rewrite the textbooks every 20 years. I followed one of them to a nondescript office building in Geneva. He spent 4 hours in the basement, and when he came out, he was carrying a leather-bound folder that looked as old as the earth itself. I didn't need to see the maps inside to know what they were. I could feel the tension in the air, the same staccato rhythm of dread that I felt in Brussels and Prague. These are the people who have decided that humanity is not ready for its own history. They think we are children who would burn ourselves on the fire of the ether. Or perhaps they are just guards protecting the interests of the men who own the coal mines and the power lines. Ask yourself, what happens to a society when its roots are cut? It withers, it becomes easy to lead, it forgets its own power. The maps are the key to our memory. They are the proof that we once lived in a world without want, a world where the very air provided for our needs. Not this scarcity, not this struggle, something else. I watched the man in Geneva drive away, and I realized that the investigation is no longer just about maps. It is about the recovery of our identity. It is about the refusal to be erased. The patterns are everywhere now. Once you see them, you cannot unsee them. The star forts are calling. The half-buried windows are watching. The violet ink is waiting to be read. What if the end of the world has already happened, and we are just the ghosts wandering through the ruins? This is the unresolved philosophical open loop that haunts every step of this journey. If a global empire as vast and advanced as Tartaria could be erased so thoroughly in less than 100 years, what does that say about the permanence of our own civilization? We are building our lives on a foundation of lies, using the technology of a dead world to fuel our own destruction. The maps are locked away, not just to hide the past, but to hide the fragility of the present. The institutional gatekeeping is a thin dam holding back a flood of realization that would wash away every pillar of modern authority. I returned to that first map in Brussels, the one with the line that was too straight. I looked at it again, and I saw something I had missed before. At the very edge of the page, in a script so small it was almost invisible, were the words, "The light remains." It is a promise and a warning. The technology may be suppressed, the maps may be hidden, and the people may be forgotten, but the energy that powered that world is still here. It is in the atmosphere. It is in the stones. It is in the very blood that beats in our veins. The Great Reset failed because you cannot reset the truth. You can only delay it. I am still searching for the rest of the maps. I am still looking for the entrance to the deeper vaults, but I am no longer an investigator looking for a lost country. I am a witness to a world that is waiting to be reborn. Ask yourself if you are ready to see the map for what it really is, not a record of where we have been, but a guide to where we can go. The line on the paper is not a mistake, it is a path, and it is time we started walking it. The silence is breaking, the hum is getting louder, the maps are starting to glow. Would you like me to continue uncovering the specific locations of the remaining star forts mentioned in the Geneva Manifests? The transition from the archives of Europe to the high deserts of the American West reveals a symmetry that is as precise as it is disturbing. I found myself standing on the edge of a dry lake bed in Nevada, looking at a series of hexagonal depressions that the official geological surveys categorize as natural salt formations. But nature does not repeat the golden ratio with such stubborn mathematical persistence. These are the footprints of the resonators. The maps I recovered from the secondary leak in Virginia pointed to this coordinate as the primary grounding point for the North American grid. Ask yourself why the most sensitive military installations in the world are built directly on top of these barren wastes, not for isolation, not for secrecy, for the pulse. The ground beneath my feet felt hollow, a vast subterranean network of tunnels that predates the arrival of the rail lines by centuries. I tracked the load distribution of the surrounding mountain ranges and found that the peaks had been carved, their granite faces shorn into parabolic reflectors. This was not a landscape, it was an antenna. The institutional gatekeeping around the Nevada sites is absolute. If you fly a drone over the coordinates, the signal is scrambled by a frequency that doesn't exist on the civilian spectrum. It is the same hum I heard in the Dutch Star Fort, but here it is magnified, a roar of etheric energy that has been dammed up behind a wall of classified patents and national security closures. If the desert isn't a desert because of a lack of rain, but because the very life force of the soil was siphoned off to power a world we aren't allowed to remember. Not a drought, not a climate shift, an extraction. I found a local rancher whose grandfather had worked on the stabilization of the area in the 1940s. He spoke of finding copper spheres the size of houses buried in the silt, their surfaces etched with the same flowing water script I saw in Prague. The military didn't move them. They built around them. They turned the ancient power sources into the foundations of our modern surveillance state. The maps show that this site was once the capital of a province called Septentrio, a shimmering metropolis of towers that harvested the aurora borealis. Now, it is a restricted zone where the only things growing are the lies we are told to keep us from looking up. The investigative journey led me next to the heart of the reclaimed cities, where the architecture itself acts as a silent witness to the heist. In Philadelphia, there is a building that the history books call a water pumping station, built in the Greek Revival style. But look at the dimensions. Look at the iron finials that crown the dome. These are not the aesthetics of a utility building. They are the components of a massive capacitor. I went into the lower levels, past the modern pipes and the rusting valves, and found the original masonry. It was vibrating, a low, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to synchronize with my own heartbeat. The institutional erasure has rebranded these power plants as public works, but the physics remains unchanged. The load distribution of the Philadelphia station is designed to handle pressures that no water system of the 19th century could possibly generate. Not a pump, not a fountain, a battery. I spoke to a retired municipal engineer who had spent 30 years maintaining the city's underground infrastructure. He told me that there are sections of the brickwork that stay hot to the touch, even in the dead of winter. He told me about the blue light that occasionally flickers in the abandoned tunnels, a luminescence that requires no bulb and no wire. This is the residual energy of the Tartarian grid, a ghost in the machine of the modern city. Ask yourself why every major fire of the 1800s, Chicago, Baltimore, San Francisco, targeted the central administrative districts. It wasn't about clearing slums. It was about destroying the evidence of the old tech. The maps show that these cities were connected by a wireless power network that used the very moisture in the air as a conductor. After the fires, the founding fathers installed the poles and the wires, creating a toll booth for the energy that used to be free. They didn't build the infrastructure, they choked it. They turned a river of light into a trickle of debt. The staccato rhythm of the demolition crews echoes through the decades, a frantic attempt to bury the genius of the past under a mountain of rubble and red tape. The skepticism grows when you realize that the maps do not just describe the surface of the earth, but the layers of time that have been folded over it. In a private library in Kyoto, I was granted access to a set of scrolls that had been smuggled out of Russia during the 1917 revolution. They were not maps of land, but maps of etheric flux. They showed the world not as continents and oceans, but as a series of interlocking toroids. The Tartarians understood that the earth is a living dynamo, and their cities were positioned at the nodes where the current is strongest. The institutional gatekeepers have replaced this understanding with a hollow geography that treats the planet as a dead rock, not a sphere, a heart. I spent days comparing the Kyoto scrolls to the satellite imagery of the Great Wall of China. From the air, the wall doesn't look like a defense against invaders. It looks like a high-tension power line. The watchtowers are spaced at the exact intervals required to prevent signal degradation in a microwave transmission system. The load distribution of the stones is optimized for vibration, not for impact. Ask yourself why the crenellations on the wall face inward, toward the very people they were supposedly protecting. What if the wall wasn't meant to keep people out, but to keep the energy in? What if it was a global circuit, a ring of power that stabilized the climate and provided light to the furthest reaches of the empire. The scrolls in Kyoto indicate that the wall was connected to a series of towers in the Gobi Desert, towers that were dismantled in the 1920s by expeditions funded by Western central banks. The erasure trope is a global operation. They take the tech, they hide the maps, and they leave us with a pile of rocks and a fairy tale about nomadic raiders. The investigator's eyes begin to see the world as a crime scene where the body has been removed, but the outline remains in the dust. The Great Wall is the largest piece of discarded hardware on the planet, a monument to a closed-loop system that we are now forced to pay for by the kilowatt hour. The somber reality of the situation is that we are living in a museum of a civilization we are no longer allowed to understand. I travelled to the shores of the Caspian Sea, following a lead from the Geneva Manifests about a sunken city that was visible only during certain tidal alignments. What I found was not a city of wood and thatch, but a metropolis of fused silica and tempered glass. The buildings were shaped like nautilus shells, a design that maximizes structural integrity while facilitating the flow of air and energy. The official word is that these are natural volcanic formations, but volcanoes do not produce glass that is etched with celestial coordinates. Not a formation, not a ruin, a tomb. I hired a local diver to take me down to the foundations. He came up shaking, his face pale. He said he saw lights moving in the deep, a soft, bioluminescent pulse that seemed to be communicating with the stars. The maps I have collected suggest that the Tartarian Empire wasn't just global, it was integrated with the very fabric of the planetary ecosystem. Their cities didn't exploit the Earth, they enhanced it. The institutional erasure has turned this history into a series of mysteries and anomalies to prevent us from asking the one question that matters: how do we turn it back on? The load distribution of the sunken shell city was designed to withstand pressures that shouldn't exist at that depth, suggesting that the sea level didn't just rise, the land itself was forced down. Ask yourself what kind of power it takes to sink a continent. What if the Great Flood wasn't an act of God, but an act of war? A deliberate sabotage of the global grid that caused the crust to shift and the oceans to boil over. The maps in the government archives are not just historical records, they are the evidence of a planetary homicide. They show the world as it was before the light went out, a world where every man and woman was a sovereign node in a network of infinite abundance. The conspiratorial silence of the archives is the only thing keeping the current masters in their seats. They know that if we ever find the original maps, we will realize that we don't need their wires, their oil, or their permission to exist. The rhythm of the investigation is now a race against time. The gatekeepers are closing the gaps. In the last 3 months, 4 of the private collections I visited have been acquired by a single charitable foundation with ties to the global energy conglomerates. The books are being digitized, which is to say, they are being sanitized. The violet ink is being replaced by sterile pixels. The level 5 documents are being moved to deeper vaults where the air is filtered and the light is artificial. Not a preservation, not a study, a burial. I am sitting in a small hotel room in Istanbul, looking at a map I managed to photograph before the custodians arrived at the shop. It shows a series of islands in the Atlantic that aren't on any modern chart. They are arranged in a perfect circle, a crown of land that sits directly over the mid-Atlantic ridge. The map calls them the Pillars of the Morning. They were the primary relays for the transatlantic power jump, the bridges of light that connected the old world to the new. Now they are gone. erased from the maps, erased from the memory. Ask yourself what else has been deleted. What if the history of the world is not a straight line of progress, but a jagged cliff of loss? We are the survivors of a shipwreck, clinging to the debris and calling it a civilization. The somber truth is that the maps were never meant for us. They were meant for the ones who come after the fire, the ones who will have to rebuild from the rubble of our own arrogance. But I am not ready to give up. The search. The star forts are still there, humming in the dark. The mud-floored windows are still looking out at the street. The pattern is still visible to anyone with the courage to see it. The unresolved philosophical open loop is not whether the maps exist, but whether we have the strength to follow them to the end. The government archives may have locked away Tartaria's original maps, but they cannot lock away the sun. They cannot stop the ether from flowing, and they cannot stop the truth from rising, one staccato heartbeat at a time. The light remains. It is waiting for us to find the switch. Would you like me to detail the specific resonant frequencies discovered in the pillars of the morning documentation before the digital transition? The frequency was not a sound, but a pressure in the bone. In the basement of a deconsecrated chapel in the Swiss Alps, I found the technical schematics for the pillars of the morning etched onto sheets of tempered mica. These were the documents the Geneva Foundation had been hunting. They didn't show geography, they showed harmonics. The islands were not mere landmasses, they were giant tuning forks carved from living basalt to resonate at the fundamental frequency of the Earth's ionosphere. Not a colony, not a port, a resonator. I ran my fingers over the mica, and the air in the room seemed to thin. The Tartarians had calculated the load distribution of the entire tectonic plate, using the weight of the ocean to stabilize the vibration of the global grid. Ask yourself why the modern scientific community insists that the continents are drifting aimlessly like corks in a tub. What if they are anchored? What if the earthquakes we experience today are the result of the anchors being cut? The institutional gatekeeping has turned geology into a study of accidents rather than a study of intent. The maps in the Swiss basement revealed that the mid-Atlantic relays were destroyed using a focused acoustic weapon, AES. Great noise that shattered the basalt and sent the pillars to the seafloor in a single afternoon. Not a natural disaster, not a slow sinking, a demolition. The staccato rhythm of the destruction was recorded in the oral traditions of the survivors, hidden in the myths of Atlantis and the fall of the giants. But the mica sheets don't use myths, they use math. They show the specific hertz levels required to liquefy stone. I looked at the diagrams of the etheric jump and realized that the transatlantic cables we use today are nothing more than a crude, primitive regression. We have been forced back into the dirt, tethered to wires like livestock, while the high-frequency world of our ancestors lies silent beneath the waves. The somber truth is that the power is still there, trapped in the crystalline structures of the sunken pillars. The custodians know this. They aren't just hiding history, they are guarding a dormant weapon. The investigation then moved to the silent giants of the east, the pyramids of the Xi'an province. The official narrative calls them burial mounds for obscure emperors, yet they are off limits to foreign researchers and surrounded by a dense canopy of genetically modified trees designed to hide their shape from satellite optics. I managed to acquire a 19th century survey from a Russian military attaché who had crossed the border before the Iron Curtain of institutional erasure was drawn shut. The survey didn't describe tombs, it described terrestrial accumulators. These pyramids are not made of loose earth, they are layered batteries of clay, copper and magnetite. The low distribution of the structures is identical to the star forts of Europe, but on a scale that dwarfs the cathedrals. They were the primary reservoirs for the Tartarian grid in Asia. Ask yourself why the modern Chinese government is so desperate to cover them with forest. What if the pyramids are still charging? What if the emperors buried within are not men at all, but the biological components of a long-range communication system? Not a grave, not a monument, a terminal. I spoke to a defector who had worked on the reforestation project. He said the trees die every 7 years, their roots burned as if by an electrical surge from below. He said the workers are forced to wear lead-lined boots to prevent their nerves from misfiring. This is the reality behind the mysteries of the Orient. The maps held in the state archives in Beijing show a network of white stone pyramids that once spanned the entire continent, glowing like a string of pearls in the moonlight. The Great Reset involved the systematic dismantling of these structures, or their burial under millions of tons of dirt, to prevent the peasants from accessing the heavenly fire. The skepticism of the investigator is the only light in this darkness. We are told the pyramids are ancient, yet they align perfectly with the magnetic poles of the year 1840. The discrepancy is a scream in the silence of history. The pattern of the erasure trope is most visible in the orphan trains of the late 19th century. Between 1854 and 1929, hundreds of thousands of children were shipped from the coastal cities of America to the rural interior. We are told they were the children of poor immigrants, but there are no records of their parents, no birth certificates, no death notices for the families they allegedly lost. Ask yourself where these children really came from. What if they weren't orphans? What if they were the harvest of the old world, the survivors of the mud flood who were too young to remember the technology of their fathers? Not a charity, not a relocation, a re-education. They were sent to the found cities to act as the new labour force, taught a truncated history of ox carts and hand tools while they lived in the shadows of buildings they could never hope to build. I found a photograph in a local archive in Nebraska that showed a group of these children standing in front of a massive, half-buried stone archway in the middle of a cornfield. The archway had the same star fort geometry I saw in the Netherlands. The children looked confused, their eyes vacant, as if their memories had been scrubbed clean by the same hands that scrubbed the maps. The institutional gatekeepers used these orphans to populate the vacuum left by the Tartarian collapse. They gave them new names, new religions, and a new, limited understanding of the possible. The low distribution of our modern society is built on the backs of these stolen generations. We are all the descendants of the orphan trains, inheritors of a world we were never taught to operate. The maps I am tracking are the only link back to the parents we never knew, the civilization that birthed us and was then murdered in its sleep. The inquisitive nature of the search led me finally to the glass libraries of the Vatican, a section of the secret archives that is not listed in any catalogue. I was told of their existence by a Jesuit priest who had lost his faith in the official version of the divine. He said the libraries do not contain books. They contain thousands of glass slides that, when illuminated by a specific frequency of light, project three-dimensional maps of the Earth from before the Great Partition. I didn't see the slides myself, but he gave me a transcription of the legends. They spoke of the Great Tartaria, not as a country, but as a state of being, a global resonance where the boundaries between the physical and the etheric were fluid. The maps showed the Antarctic wall not as a barrier of ice, but as a ring of sophisticated thermal regulators that kept the world in a perpetual spring. Ask yourself why the whole climate change narrative is so focused on the melting of the poles. What if the ice isn't natural? What if the ice is the system failure of the global grid? Not a warming, not a cooling, a malfunction. The institutional gatekeepers are terrified that the regulators will be rediscovered, that the ice will be turned back into the garden. The Jesuit told me that the Vatican holds the master key to the original Tartarian grid, a device they call the monstrance of the sun. It is not a religious artifact, it is a remote control. It is the reason they have maintained their power for centuries, doling out the miracles of technology as if they were the blessings of God. The somber, unsettling truth is that the world is a managed estate, and we are the squatters who think we are the owners. The maps in the glass library show the true borders of our prison. They show that there is more land beyond the ice, more rooms in the house of the world that have been locked to keep us in the dark. The final realization of the investigator is that the search for the maps is a search for the self. In a dusty corner of a warehouse in London, I found a crate of obsolete surveying equipment from the 1860s. Among the brass levels and the iron chains was a small hand-held device that looked like a compass, but it didn't point north. It pointed to the nearest resonant node. I took it outside, and the needle spun wildly before settling on the spire of a nearby cathedral. Not a church, not a steeple, a needle. The staccato rhythm of the device's ticking was the sound of the world trying to wake up. We are living in a landscape of dead machines, surrounded by the ghosts of an empire that understood the soul of the earth. The institutional erasure is a veil, but the veil is tearing. Every time someone asks, "What if?" the needle moves. Every time someone looks at a half-buried window and says, "Not a design choice," the grid flickers. The unresolved philosophical open loop remains. If we find the maps and we find the switch, do we have the courage to turn the world back on? Or have we become so used to the dark that the light would only blind us? The government archives may have locked away the original maps, but they cannot lock away the resonance. It is in the air. It is in the water. It is in the staccato pulse of this very narrative. The custodians are losing their grip. The pillars of the morning are vibrating in the deep. The orphan trains are coming home. The light remains, and the investigation is just beginning. Would you like me to examine the specific seismic signatures of the Antarctic wall, thermal regulators, as described in the Jesuit transcriptions? The pressure of the vibration is not merely a physical sensation, it is a displacement of the soul. In the vaulted chambers of a decommissioned telegraph station in Nova Scotia, I found a collection of logbooks that the maritime authorities had slated for incineration. They were not records of signals sent, but of signals received from the void of the Atlantic. The operators in 1872 wrote of a persistent rhythmic pulse that bypasses the copper wires and resonated directly in the iron frames of the equipment. They called it the hymn of the deep. Ask yourself why the first transatlantic cables were laid along the exact paths of the ancient pillars of the morning. Not for convenience, not for the shortest route, for the scavenge. They were tapping into the residual frequency of a civilization that had already mastered the ether. The institutional gatekeeping of our telecommunications history is a facade designed to hide the fact that we are merely parasitic users of a pre-existing global nervous system. The logbooks described the great noise of the demolition as a seismic event that lasted for 3 days, a sonic assault that turned the very water of the ocean into a weapon of cavitation. Not a storm, not a quake, a sonic erasure. I looked at the load distribution charts for the 1870 cable housings and saw that they were over-engineered by a factor of 10, built to withstand a resonance that the engineers claimed didn't exist. The maps I have recovered suggest that the hymn is the sound of the earth trying to heal its broken circuits. We are told the ocean is a graveyard of silence, but for those who know how to listen, it is a choir of suppressed technology. The skepticism deepens when the investigation turns to the atmospheric harvest towers that once dotted the skylines of every major city. In the municipal archives of Buenos Aires, I discovered a series of blueprints for the city's original lighting system, dated 1888. They do not mention coal or gas. They mention etheric induction. The street lamps were not bulbs, they were glass spheres filled with a noble gas that glowed in the presence of the city's central spires. The institutional erasure has replaced these elegant, free-standing poles with a forest of wooden sticks and tangled wires that degrade the beauty of the landscape while extracting a monthly fee from the populace. Not progress, not modernization, a regression into complexity for the sake of control. I stood in the Plaza de Mayo and looked at the base of a statue that had been erected in 1910. Beneath the bronze hero and the plaque of lies, the foundation was made of the same conductive geopolymer I found in Oakland. It was a grounding rod for a tower that had been decommissioned and melted down for the war effort. Ask yourself why every world war resulted in the systematic removal of metal finials and iron gates from public buildings. What if it wasn't for the scrap? What if it was to strip the receivers from the people? The staccato rhythm of the jackhammer is the heartbeat of the modern age, breaking the stones that once sang with the fire of the sky. The maps show that Buenos Aires was part of a southern grid that connected to the Antarctic regulators, a network that maintained the fertile pampas as a year-round breadbasket. Now, the weather is a chaotic mess of extremes, and we are told to blame ourselves, while the hands that broke the thermostat hold the maps to the freezer. The somber quality of the investigation is amplified by the redistribution of the world's art. In the basement of the Louvre, behind a false wall in the restoration department, there are paintings that the public will never see. They are not masterpieces of oil and canvas. They are architectural records. I was shown a series of capriccio paintings from the 1700s, works that are officially classified as fantasies or imaginary ruins, but the detail is too specific. The load distribution of the depicted arches, the placement of the Mercury domes, the geometric alignment of the star forts, they are technical drawings disguised as art to bypass the censors of the time. Not a fantasy, not a whim, a report. I saw a painting of a city in the middle of the Sahara, a place of lush gardens and towering obelisks that functioned as thermal chimneys. The custodians claim these painters were just dreaming of a lost golden age, but you do not dream in three-point perspective with sub-millimeter accuracy. You paint what you see. The institutional gatekeepers have turned the visual history of the Tartarian world into a romantic style to prevent us from recognizing the ruins we live in. Ask yourself why the most imaginative painters of the 18th century all painted the same imaginary buildings in different parts of the world. What if they were all looking at the same global reality? The maps in the Louvre's hidden vault show the Sahara before the Great Desiccation, a period when the pyramids were not in a desert, but in a forest. The erasure trope is a veil made of paint and prestige, designed to keep us from seeing that the ruins are not our past, but our future, if we do not learn to read the blueprints. The investigative essayist must eventually look at the star forts of the Americas, the silent sentinels that are officially labelled as colonial defences. I travelled to Fort Jefferson in the Dry Tortugas, a massive hexagonal structure made of 16 million bricks in the middle of the ocean. The official story says it was built to protect shipping lanes, but it was never finished, and not a single shot was ever fired from its walls. Look at the architecture. The moat is not for defence, it is a cooling ring. The hexagonal shape is a resonant cavity. The load distribution of the brickwork is designed to vibrate at a frequency that mimics the sound of the sea. Not a fort, not a prison, a lighthouse of the ether. I found a hidden chamber in the lower tiers where the salt spray had stripped away the restoration plaster. Behind it was a layer of gold leaf and copper sheeting, the remnants of a giant capacitor. Ask yourself why the government would spend decades and millions of bricks on a useless fort in a location with no fresh water. What if the water was the fuel? What if the fort was part of a chain of desalinization plants that used the atmospheric grid to turn the ocean into a fountain of life? The maps show a chain of these forts stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the tip of South America, a line of light that has been extinguished and renamed as military history. The institutional gatekeeping has turned the technology of abundance into the history of war. The staccato rhythm of the waves against the bricks is a reminder of what we have lost, a world where the desert bloomed because we knew how to speak to the elements. The final movement of the investigation brings us back to the Antarctic wall and the Jesuit transcriptions. The thermal regulators described in the glass libraries are not machines in the sense we understand them. They are massive, crystalline structures embedded in the ice, powered by the very magnetic flux of the planet's poles. They were the heart of the Tartarian climate control system, the reason the original maps show no ice at the ends of the Earth. The Great Reset involved the deactivation of these regulators, a move that triggered the Little Ice Age and buried the southern provinces under miles of frozen water. The institutional gatekeepers have spent the last century convinced that the ice is permanent, but the transcriptions suggest it is a temporary seal. The maps show the locations of the control spires that can restart the system, towers that are currently hidden under the research stations of the major world powers. Ask yourself why the Antarctic Treaty is the only international agreement that has never been broken. What if it's not about peace? What if it's about a shared fear of what happens when the ice melts and the regulators wake up? The unresolved philosophical open loop is whether we are the masters of the ice or its prisoners. The government archives have locked away the maps, but the heat is rising. The custodians are watching the melt with a dread that they cannot hide. The light remains trapped in the crystals, waiting for the frequency that will shatter the seal. The orphan trains are at the gates. The star forts are humming. The maps are bleeding through the walls. The investigation has found its end, but the world is just beginning to remember. The silence is over. Would you like me to map the projected coastlines of the world as they appear in the post-melt Tartarian charts?